Jazz, conceived in Africa, born and raised in America, is a music that embodies American ideals as well as the long social, political, and institutional struggle of Black Americans to have access to those ideals. The beauty of jazz is that such a powerful, breathtaking music arose from pain and strife and gave rise to strength and pride. The history and evolution of jazz follows the history and evolution of African Americans. It is a history filled with talented musicians who broke boundaries as they explored new sounds and rhythms, encountered new people and genres, and exchanged and shared their music to create a new, blended sound that echoes with the beauty of two different cultures brought together as one.
The evolution of jazz begins in West Africa. America was a far-off yet to be discovered land. The West African tribes and empires consisted of a diverse group of peoples, cultures, and religions, but the power of music was universal. West African folk musicians skillfully utilized a wide range of instruments, including drums, bells, and flutes. A call and response style of singing characterized by choir voices and a myriad of rhythms created a complex religious and cultural tradition, as well as a way of self-expression. Music was an outlet, one that would become critical in the dark times ahead.
In 1619, the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, millions of Africans will be enslaved on plantations throughout the Americas. They were separated from their homes and families and forced to work under abhorrent conditions in a strange new land. However, nothing, not even thousands of miles of ocean, could separate them from their music. Music was an integral part of the lives of enslaved people. While working in fields, enslaved people sang work songs or field hollers that were often characterized by the rhythmic beat and call and response style singing of African religious music. While slave owners assumed these songs were simply for enjoyment and to help pass the time, they were actually a form of communication. Drums were used by enslaved people to send messages in a sort of Morse code about plans for revolts and escapes. However, after the Stonewall Rebellion of 1739, drums were banned from plantations. But enslaved people were way ahead of them. They began using the lyrics of spirituals to communicate. Spirituals were religious songs often used by enslaved people to express their pent-up sorrows. The use of spirituals as a method of communication was particularly clever because slaves were, in a sense, using a form of oppression to free themselves from oppression.
Slave owners and other white plantation workers heard the music of slaves, but refused to acknowledge it as music. In the eyes of white Americans, the only good music was classical music, the music of white European composers. Unable to look past their preconceived ideas of what music is and should be, white Americans allowed their racist ideology to blind them from extraordinary talent and creativity. While classical music stayed frozen in time, slave songs and spirituals evolved with the people who sang them. After slavery was abolished in 1865, many former slaves became sharecroppers, so spirituals and sorrow songs were much more likely to be sung by individuals than in groups and with much more personal, individualized lyrics. This new style of singing came to be known as the blues.
The blues is a music that was used primarily as self-expression. I consider some of the slave hollers like bluesy. So it was used for people to express how they were feeling. It was used for people to share their oppression, or sometimes it was used to share their joy. I just think that genre of music, the blues, helped musicians to express themselves at a time when they were very oppressed. And then from this blues style, it evolved into jazz, but it all has the blues in it.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, in 1892, a new genre called ragtime rapidly arrived on the American music scene. Ragtime is a style of singing characterized by a syncopated rhythm, or ragged time. The importance of rhythm and the use of instruments such as the banjo and bones in ragtime can be traced back to early slave songs. The seemingly overnight success of ragtime is largely due to the invention of the pianola, a mechanism that enabled a piano to play itself. This allowed people who may not have been musically endowed to enjoy the syncopated rhythm of talented ragtime musicians such as Scott Joplin.
Both ragtime and blues were great styles of music on their own, but when Black musicians in the city of New Orleans merged these two genres into one, something truly spectacular was produced.
By the 19th century, New Orleans was a city brimming with cultural and ethnic diversity. However, after the Civil War, restrictive racial codes segregated the city. Blacks and Creoles lived in one section while whites lived in another. On top of segregation, an 1897 law restricted prostitution to the Black and Creole section of the city, which became known as Storyville. The Creoles weren't too happy with these developments. However, the music of the city thrived. As saloons and sporting houses began popping up throughout Storyville, they employed Black and Creole musicians who exchanged their music to create a new genre known as Dixieland jazz. Dixieland jazz consisted of a standard musical ensemble in which a trumpet or cornet carried the melody while various other instruments played the rhythm section. The music blended the classical European music of many Creoles with ragtime and the blues, the structured style of Creole musicians, and the improvisational, experimental style of black musicians combined to produce a genre that was a mix of both. Storyville had become a hub of music and culture. But in 1917, Storyville was shut down. Many displaced musicians set off for cities like Memphis, Chicago, and New York. With new places and new people came new music.
In the early 1900s, the stage was set for Chicago jazz to evolve and take the music world by storm. Between 1910 and 1920, during the Great Migration, there was an influx of 60,000 blacks to Chicago, more than doubling its black population. Although race relations in Chicago were bad, many black jazz musicians such as Joe King Oliver found much more opportunity in Chicago than New Orleans. Opportunity also came in the form of new technology. In 1909, the invention of the sound recording allowed jazz music, which was so improvisational that it was rarely written down, to be enjoyed by the masses. A famous New Orleans jazz musician named Louis Armstrong rose to international fame after moving to Chicago. Armstrong is best known for his endless supply of talent and for the invention of scat singing, which substituted nonsense syllables for notes in a way that used the voice as an instrument.
Meanwhile, New York City was in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance, which led to an explosion of jazz and black music. A Harlem Renaissance musician named Duke Ellington gave rise to a cool, sophisticated-sounding jazz that came to be called swing. Unlike Armstrong's jazz, which was considered hot jazz for its speed and complex improvisation, Duke Ellington's swing was carefully rehearsed and performed by a big band. Swing became a nationwide success.
But even the most successful prominent black jazz musicians dealt with racism. Jim Crow laws forced black musicians to stay at different hotels and eat at different restaurants. They worked more but were paid less. In the South, integrated bands weren't even allowed to play. As our nation entered the 1940s and the era of modern jazz began, we were still plagued by an archaic system of social injustice.
Modern jazz grew out of the swing era of the 1930s. The earliest style of modern jazz, known as bop, can best be described as a collective rebellion against swing. Jazz musicians were tired of carefully rehearsed, repetitive mass appeal of swing and reverted to bop, a style that was fast-paced and aggressive. Bop was filled with complex melodies and a high degree of syncopation. Although bop was too fast-paced and complex to have a mass appeal, jazz musicians didn't care. Bop was a way to push limits and test their abilities. By the 1950s, jazz began a series of transitions. It transitioned from bop to cool and West Coast jazz to hard bop to mellow jazz and free jazz. This was largely to Miles Davis, a jazz musician brimming with talent and creativity. In 1949, Davis formed an interracial band that became known for a unique sound, caused in part by the cool, subdued feeling of their solos. This created an overall delicate effect that was known as the birth of the cool. Cool jazz is a quiet form of jazz, with very few loud or high notes. Cool jazz had a strong influence on West Coast jazz, which had a light, cool, simple melody and was sometimes referred to as polite jazz. By the time West Coast jazz arrived on the scene, Davis had already transitioned from cool jazz to hard bop and then to mellow jazz.
And despite his success, Miles Davis faced racism. In 1959, he was beaten by a New York police officer while taking a breather between sets. As a result, he began taking a more active role in politics. The time was ripe. The civil rights movement emerged during the 1950s and blossomed during the 1960s. As African Americans fought for the rights and equality they deserved, jazz fought for the recognition it deserved. Long gone were the days when black music went unacknowledged and talents unrecognized. And yet jazz, when compared to white European classical music, was always deemed less complex and less technical. A famous jazz and classical musician named Wynton Marsalis refused to let that stand. In 1983, Marsalis became the first musician to win a Grammy for classical music and a Grammy for jazz. Marsalis was a firm believer that jazz was more intricate and technically demanding than classical music. Later in his career, Marsalis began to focus less on classical music and more on jazz, which he deemed the ultimate 20th century music.
Within the evolution of jazz lies a centuries-long struggle for equality and freedom. Jazz was born during an era when only white European classical music was considered true music. But as great as classical music is, classical music today is the same as it was 2-3 centuries ago, whereas jazz is constantly growing and changing. Jazz can be fast or slow, loud or quiet, soft or hard, organized or improvised, or anywhere in between. Jazz reacts and evolves with the lives and emotions of those playing it. And it's this ability to react, to grow, and change, this ability that classical music lacks, that makes jazz so powerful and successful. Jazz is an embodiment of the African American experience, which is why although change may be difficult, scary, uncomfortable, change is necessary for music and for society to grow and to thrive.